A black child interrupts his father's wedding and says, "Dad, call 911 immediately and don't marry her, please." What mysterious truth lay behind that innocent facade? Clara delicately adjusted her veil in front of the mirror. Her reflection watched her with a serenity she did not feel inside. The soft lights of the room highlighted every detail of her immaculately tailored white dress, an image of perfection she had been constructing for months. But this outer calm hid a whirlwind of emotions that threatened to consume her. In just a few minutes, she would be walking down the aisle to marry Samuel, the man who had transformed her life in the past year. However, behind her clear eyes, Clara knew there was something she could never tell him. The sound of the door interrupted her thoughts, and as she turned around, she saw Paula, her older sister, enter with an air of feigned nonchalance. Paula, always elegant, always with a smile that bordered on sarcastic, was the only person Clara trusted enough to show her true fears. She was her confidant, but also the person who pushed her the most to move forward, to not let the weight of her secrets consume her. "You look beautiful," Paula said as she leaned against the door frame. "Samuel won't be able to take his eyes off you." Clara smiled, though the gesture felt empty. "Thank you. I just want everything to be perfect today," she replied, her voice a little weaker than she would have liked. Paula approached and took Clara's hands, squeezing them firmly. "Listen, everything will be fine. You've earned it. Samuel is a good man, and this is the beginning of a new life for you. For both of you." "I know," Clara said, diverting her gaze for a second, as if that brief moment of doubt could be erased if she didn't acknowledge it. "It's just that sometimes I feel like I'm not prepared for all this, for what's to come." Paula, always calculating, let out a slight laugh. "No one is really prepared for marriage. It's a leap into the unknown. But you're here now. You just have to take that step and keep walking, Clara." The echo of those words resonated in Clara's head as she looked at herself in the mirror again. Could she really keep walking, knowing what she knew? Fear clawed at her heart, but her sister was right. She had come too far to turn back now. Samuel adored her, and although she didn't always feel deserving of his love, she needed to cling to it as her only salvation. A gentle knock on the door interrupted their conversation. It was Samuel, asking permission to speak with Clara before the ceremony. Clara and Paula exchanged a look. In all traditions, it was assumed that the bride and groom should not see each other before the wedding, but Samuel was not one to follow conventions. Paula winked at her complicitly and left the room, leaving them alone. Samuel entered with a nervous smile, his warm eyes lighting up at the sight of Clara. "I couldn't wait any longer. I had to see you," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. Clara watched him approach. This man, with a calm demeanor and sincere gaze, had rescued her from an abyss she never thought she could escape. And although part of her loved him, the other part, the one that held the darkest secrets, knew that Samuel didn't know even half the truth. "You are simply perfect," Samuel murmured as he stopped in front of her. "I can't believe you're about to become my wife." Clara smiled and took his hand. The warmth of his skin gave her a brief sense of comfort. "Neither can I," she replied, and although her words sounded sweet, there was a storm inside her that she could not calm. "David is excited too," Samuel said with a twinkle in his eyes. "I think he likes you more than you want to admit." The mention of David brought an even greater weight to Clara's heart. Samuel's son, just 10 years old, was a constant and watchful presence in their lives. From the beginning, Clara had done everything in her power to win his trust, but David was not an easy child to read. Although he always seemed polite and well-mannered, Clara felt that something in his gaze judged her, as if he could see beyond the facade she had built. "He's a good boy," Clara replied, trying not to show the discomfort she felt each time David's name came up in conversation. I hope that in time, we can become closer. Samuel caressed Clara's face gently. You will. I know it. He needs a maternal figure. And you are everything I could wish for him and for me. The tenderness in Samuel's words made Clara's chest tighten. How could she reciprocate that love when her life was built on a lie? Thank you, was all she could muster, unable to find the right words for the internal storm that consumed her. The silence stretched longer than expected, and Samuel, sensing the tension, tried to dispel it with a joke. Well, I better go before they accuse us of breaking tradition. See you at the altar. Clara smiled and watched him leave. But the moment the door closed behind him, she felt as if her breath had been cut off. She was left alone, in front of the mirror, struggling to maintain her composure. Meanwhile, at the other end of the house, David sat in a chair next to his grandmother, adjusting his tie with trembling fingers. Despite his young age, his mind was filled with dark thoughts and worries that were not typical for a child. He watched the guests arrive, each with their own smile and joy, but David could not shake off what he had discovered just a few weeks ago. The pieces of the puzzle he had formed were not clear, but something inside him told him that Clara's presence in their lives would bring problems his father had not anticipated. Are you okay, honey? His grandmother asked, a sweet and attentive woman who noticed when something was not right with her grandson. David nodded, though his gaze did not stray from the floor. Yes, Grandma. I'm just nervous about the wedding. She smiled at him tenderly and stroked his hair. It's normal, but everything will be all right. Clara is a good woman, and your dad is very happy. David didn't respond. He didn't want to argue with his grandmother, but something inside him screamed that Clara was not what she seemed. He didn't yet have clear evidence, but he knew that something was deeply wrong. His instinct, always strong, told him that the truth would soon come to light. And when it did, it would change everything. At the altar, as the final preparations were made and guests took their seats, Clara wondered if she would ever be able to move forward without her past catching up to her. She didn't know how much longer she could hide what she knew, but one thing was certain. This wedding marked the beginning of a path of no return, and what happened next would depend on her ability to keep everything under control. However, as she prepared to take that step, there was a child in the room who would not allow things to remain as they were. And although he did not yet know it, David would be the key to unleashing everything Clara had tried to hide. Clara took a deep breath as she waited for the moment to walk down the aisle. The minutes seemed to crawl as soft music echoed from the garden, where the guests were settling in, expectant. No matter how much she tried to calm her nerves, she felt the weight of the lie crushing her chest. She looked in the mirror one last time, aware that the smile she tried to show did not reach her eyes. Suddenly, the door opened, and Paula entered the room again, with the same carefree expression she had before. But now, there was something more on her face. A mix of urgency and tension. She closed the door behind her, making sure no one else could hear. "We have a problem," she said in a low voice. Clara looked at her through the mirror reflection. Her heart raced. "What happened?" she asked, trying to stay calm. Paula quickly approached. "It's David," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "He's acting strange, more than usual. I saw him talking to his grandmother, but there's something in his expression. It's like he knows something." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. From the beginning, she had felt that David was suspicious of her. His eyes, always watching, always inquisitive, put her in an uncomfortable position whenever they met. "Do you know what it could be?" Clara asked, trying not to show her growing panic. "I don't know, but that boy is smarter than he looks," said Paula, crossing her arms. "If he keeps digging, we might have a serious problem. We can't let anything spoil this today." Clara nodded, although her mind was already immersed in dark thoughts. She had done everything possible to win David over, to show him that she could be a good figure in his life. But there was always that barrier. What if he had discovered something? Something that could ruin not just the wedding, but the entire facade she had built with so much effort. Before they could continue the conversation, one of the event assistants called from the door. "It's time. The ceremony is about to start." Paula looked at Clara with a firm gesture. "Keep your composure. No one will know anything if you stay calm. And watch what you do with that boy. We're playing for much more than a wedding here." Clara nodded again, swallowing the lump in her throat. She stood up and adjusted her dress, ready to face what was coming, although inside she was on the verge of collapsing. Outside, Samuel waited at the altar, nervous but excited. He looked at the row of guests and, especially, at his son, seated in the first row next to his grandmother. David maintained a serious expression, his eyes fixed on the aisle where Clara would soon appear. Samuel had noticed a change in his son's behavior in recent days, but had attributed it to the stress of the wedding and the new family adjustments. He approached his son with a smile and crouched down to his level. "Are you okay, champ?" asked Samuel, placing a hand on his shoulder. David looked at him, his face impassive. "Dad, I have to tell you something," he replied in a tone that immediately put Samuel on alert. "What's wrong?" asked Samuel, furrowing his brow. David looked around, making sure no one else was listening. Then, in a low but firm voice, he said, "You can't marry Clara. She's not who she says she is." Samuel blinked, taken aback by his son's words. "What are you talking about, David? Clara is a good woman. She loves both of us." But David shook his head, his dark eyes reflecting a seriousness that was beyond his years. "No, Dad. I've seen it. I've heard things. Clara is not good. She has secrets." Samuel felt a void in his stomach hearing his son. The tone of his voice, the conviction in his words, were more than just a whim or childish jealousy. "David, I know it's hard for you. I know you miss your mom, and it's tough to accept someone new, but Clara makes us happy." David leaned in closer and, with a whisper that barely contained the urgency in his voice, said, "Dad, call 911. Do it now, please." The words hit Samuel like a bucket of cold water. What was his son saying? He couldn't grasp the magnitude of what those words implied, but something in David's tone caused him deep unease. "David, I don't understand." Before he could finish his sentence, the notes of the wedding march began to play. All the guests turned their heads towards the start of the aisle, where Clara appeared, walking gracefully, her bridal gown sparkling under the sunlight. David looked at his father with desperation, his large eyes filled with a mix of fear and frustration. "Dad, please, don't do this." Samuel didn't know what to do. His mind was torn between the thrill of the moment and the growing concern from his son's words. He watched Clara, who advanced with a radiant smile, but that feeling of discomfort wouldn't leave him. What did David know that he didn't? Could there really be something behind those words? But this was his day, his chance to start anew, wasn't it? Clara continued forward, each step closer to the altar, and Samuel felt the tension rising in his chest. His son's words echoed in his mind, "Call 911." Samuel tried to push those thoughts away, but doubt had already taken root. When Clara reached the end of the aisle, Samuel took her hand with a smile that tried to be genuine. Clara's eyes met Samuel's, and for a moment, her gaze wavered. It was only a second, but for Samuel, it was enough to sow even deeper unease. The priest began to speak, reciting the traditional words that had been so carefully planned. But Samuel could barely concentrate. His mind kept returning to David's words. The minutes passed, and the ceremony continued, with Clara and Samuel repeating their vows. However, just as the priest was about to ask for the ring exchange, David, who had been silent all this time, stood up decisively. "Don't do it," he shouted, his voice clear and firm, breaking the reverent silence of the ceremony. A murmur of bewilderment ran through the guests. Clara tensed, slowly turning her head towards David, her smile completely vanishing. Samuel stepped back, unsure how to react. "David, please sit down," said Samuel, mixing embarrassment and confusion. But David approached the altar, ignoring the surprised looks from the guests. "She's not what she seems, Dad. You can't marry her." Clara, maintaining a neutral expression, tried to approach David. "David, honey, what's wrong? You know we can talk about this after the ceremony." But David stepped back, distancing himself from Clara. "Dad, don't let her deceive you. Call 911. Now." The tension in the air was unbearable. The murmurs among the guests grew, and Paula, from her seat, watched the scene with a furrowed brow. Clearly, she hadn't anticipated this reaction from David. Samuel was torn internally. Everything he had built with Clara, all the happiness he had found in her, seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. He didn't know what to believe, but something inside him told him that David was acting from a place of truth. He looked at Clara, who seemed increasingly uneasy. "Samuel," said Clara in a soft tone, trying to remain calm. "It's just a misunderstanding. David is confused." But Samuel was no longer so sure. "David, what do you think is happening?" he asked, his voice trembling. David, with tears in his eyes, replied, "Dad, I promise you if you don't do something, everything is going to end badly." The ceremony was left hanging, all eyes on Samuel, waiting for his decision. The atmosphere at the altar became dense, as if the air itself had changed weight and each breath felt more difficult. The guests, perplexed, exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or remain as mere spectators of a scene no one had anticipated. Clara stood motionless next to Samuel, her hands trembling barely perceptibly as she clutched the bouquet tightly. Paula, in the front row, watched with an increasingly displeased air. Everything was spiraling out of control. Samuel looked at his son, unable to ignore the fear emanating from David's eyes. The boy was crying, but it wasn't the capricious crying of a child unwilling to accept something. It was a cry of desperation, as if he was battling something too big for him. "Dad, please," David said between sobs, taking another step towards the altar. "Don't let her do this. Don't let her come into our lives." Samuel felt a knot in his stomach. Doubt invaded him. He looked at Clara, searching for any sign that all this was a misunderstanding, a simple confusion on his son's part. But what he found in Clara's eyes was not the serenity or reassurance he had hoped for. Instead, he saw something much darker: panic. Clara was trying to maintain her composure, but her expression was tense, and for the first time, Samuel realized she was also hiding something. "David, come here. Let's talk about this afterward, okay?" Samuel said, hoping to calm the situation without making it worse. He felt the stares of all the guests fixed on him, the discomfort growing around him. But David did not move. "No, it has to be now," he said, his voice breaking. "Dad, she's not who you think she is. She's not the person she shows you. I've heard things I can't ignore." David took a deep breath and looked at Clara with a mix of pain and anger. "She knows what happened to Mom." The murmuring among the guests intensified, but Samuel could barely hear it. The mention of his late wife's name, in that context, was like a direct blow to his chest. "What are you saying, David?" he asked, his voice trembling as he sought answers from his son. Clara intervened, her voice tinged with urgency, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Samuel, this is nothing more than the result of David's trauma. He's been struggling with the loss of his mother, and I think all this is a way of manifesting his pain. I truly understand. Don't take it seriously. He's just confused." She tried to sound calm, but the words came out too quickly, as if she needed to convince herself as much as Samuel. David looked at her with disdain. "I'm not confused. I heard what you said when you thought no one was listening. Mom didn't die in an accident. You had something to do with it." David's last words echoed in the air like a bomb, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. Samuel felt as if the entire world was shaking beneath his feet. "That's absurd," exclaimed Paula from her seat, standing up and quickly approaching. "David, how can you say something so horrible? You're accusing Clara of something monstrous without evidence. Samuel, you can't let this continue." But Samuel could barely hear Paula. His mind was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions and memories that assaulted him. His wife's accident had been one of the most painful moments of his life, and the idea that there might be something more behind it, something that Clara knew, filled him with a mix of anger and fear. Clara, seeing that she was losing control, took a step forward. "Samuel, please, don't listen to these things. I would never harm anyone, much less David's mother. All of this is a terrible misunderstanding. I promise." But Samuel stepped back, his eyes desperately searching for the truth in the face of the woman he was about to marry. "What does David think he knows, Clara? What haven't you told me?" Clara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, David intervened again. "Dad, I found messages on her phone. Conversations with a man talking about the night Mom died. Clara is not who she says she is. I've been investigating. I can't explain it all now, but if you don't do something, we could lose much more than this wedding." The bewilderment and distress on Samuel's face were palpable. He brought a hand to his head, trying to process what he was hearing. Everything seemed unreal, but the firm tone of his son, the intensity in his eyes, filled him with a doubt he couldn't ignore. Paula, seeing things were getting out of hand, decided to act more aggressively. "This is madness. Samuel, don't let the delusion of a child ruin the most important day of your life. Clara is the best thing that's happened to you since everything changed." But even Paula, for a moment, let a shadow of concern show on her face. Samuel looked at her, searching for some kind of reassurance. But the more he tried to find an explanation, the more he realized that, for the first time, he felt completely lost. Could he trust Clara? Or was David seeing something he had been blind to notice? "I need time," Samuel finally said, his voice broken. "I can't continue with this now. Not like this." The guests, surprised and confused, watched as Samuel stepped back, distancing himself from Clara. Clara looked at him with a mix of desperation and plea, as if her world was crumbling at that very moment. "Samuel, please," she murmured, on the verge of tears. But Samuel shook his head. "I'm sorry, Clara. I can't go on without knowing the truth. Not when my son is here, telling me something is terribly wrong." David, still standing, watched his father with relief, though his small body still trembled with the tension of the moment. The priest, who had been silently observing the entire unfolding, stepped forward. "Perhaps we should stop this for now," he suggested in a low voice, sensing the gravity of the situation. Samuel nodded slowly, looking at Clara one last time before turning to David. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder and guided him to the end of the altar, leaving Clara standing there, alone, under the gaze of all those present. Paula, furious, approached Clara. "This is ridiculous. We can't let everything end like this." But Clara, with tears in her eyes, couldn't respond. She knew deep down that this was just the beginning of something much darker. Clara stood frozen at the altar, watching Samuel and David walk away. The world around her blurred. The laughter and murmurs of the guests seemed distant, almost unreal. The wedding, which was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, was crumbling before her eyes. The future she had imagined, the new life she had longed for, seemed to slip away with every step Samuel took. Paula was the first to react, quickly approaching Clara and grabbing her arm firmly. "You can't let them leave like this," she murmured, squeezing her arm. "Go after him. Do something before it's too late." Clara didn't respond immediately. In her mind, David's words echoed over and over. "Mom didn't die in an accident. You had something to do with it." Her breathing quickened, and for a moment she thought she might faint. How had things gotten this far? How had David discovered anything? It was supposed to be under control. Paula shook her, snapping her out of her trance. "Clara, Samuel is leaving. You need to talk to him now, or you'll lose him." With a trembling voice, Clara nodded and began to walk quickly toward where Samuel and David were headed, not quite sure what to say or how to explain. Paula followed closely, her steps echoing with the same urgency as Clara's heartbeat. Exiting the garden where the ceremony took place, Clara saw Samuel and David standing in a corner, in a conversation that seemed to be growing more intense by the moment. Samuel's face was contorted, filled with a mix of disbelief and confusion, while David gestured desperately, trying to make him understand. "Samuel," Clara called out, approaching. Her voice trembled, but there was urgency in it. "Please, listen to me. This can't end like this." Samuel looked up at her, but his expression was no longer that of the loving, confident man who had looked at her so affectionately in the months prior. Now his eyes were clouded with doubt. "Clara," he started, his voice breaking, "David is saying things I can't just ignore." "I know," Clara quickly replied, trying to stay calm, though her mind was frantically working on an explanation. "David is confused. He's hurt by everything that has happened. I know this is hard for him, for all of us." David, interrupting the conversation, stepped forward. "I'm not confused, Dad. I've been seeing things clearly. Clara is not who you think she is." Clara felt a knot in her stomach. How much did David know? How much had he discovered? She knew she needed to handle the situation carefully. "David, dear," she said, trying to sound maternal and conciliatory, "I understand you miss your mom, and this can be very hard for you. But I'm not your enemy. I only want the best for you and your dad." David looked at her with a mix of anger and determination. "No, I've heard your conversations. You know what happened to Mom. You were talking to that man. Why don't you tell Dad about him?" Clara's heart skipped a beat. David had heard more than she had imagined. Samuel stared at her intently, waiting for an answer. Her hands trembled, and for the first time, she felt out of control of the situation. "What man are you talking about, Clara?" Samuel asked, his voice low but loaded with tension. Clara swallowed hard and looked away for a moment, searching for the right words. She couldn't lose him, couldn't let her entire world crumble over a misunderstanding. "Samuel, listen to me," she began, trying to sound as convincing as possible. "David has misunderstood some things. I did speak to an old friend, yes, but it has nothing to do with what he's implying." "That's not true," David shouted. "I heard everything. You said you couldn't let Dad know the truth about what happened to Mom." The tension in the air was palpable. Samuel closed his eyes, trying to process everything he was hearing. "Clara, please," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I need you to tell me the truth. I can't continue this if I can't trust you." Clara stepped closer to him, gently placing a hand on his arm. "Samuel, I love you. I would never hurt you. All of this is a misunderstanding. David is hurt, and he's looking for answers where there aren't any. We need to resolve this together, as a family." But the words no longer held the same weight as before. Samuel looked at her with a mix of pain and confusion, while David, with clenched fists, kept watching her, as if waiting for a confession. "Dad, David said, his voice calmer but filled with determination. "If you can't trust me, then I don't know what else I can say. But I know what I heard, and I know Clara is lying to you." The silence that followed was unbearable. Samuel looked at his son, then at Clara, and realized he couldn't pretend everything was okay. His heart broke at the thought that David might be right, but he also couldn't dismiss the possibility that his son, still grappling with the pain of losing his mother, was seeing ghosts where there were none. Paula, who had been watching from a distance, decided to intervene, as if she believed she could salvage the situation. "Samuel," she said, approaching with a practiced smile, "please, don't let David's pain confuse you. Clara loves you, and she's done everything possible to make this family work. We're all dealing with the loss of your wife, but this is just an emotional reaction. You need time to think clearly." But Samuel didn't seem convinced. He stepped back slightly, raising a hand to stop Paula. "No, Paula, I can't ignore what's happening here." Then, he looked at Clara. "I need time to think. I can't marry you without knowing the truth, not with all this in the air." Clara felt as if the ground beneath her feet was opening up. She tried to approach Samuel again, but he stepped back, his eyes filled with pain. "Samuel, please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But Samuel had made his decision. He looked at his son and then at Clara one last time. "I'm sorry," he murmured, and without another word, he turned and started to walk away with David by his side, leaving Clara and Paula alone, standing amidst the emotional chaos they could no longer control. Clara watched as Samuel walked away, knowing he might never be the same again. What had started as the happiest day of her life had turned into her worst nightmare. Paula, frustrated, tried to maintain her composure, but her face betrayed her anger. "This isn't over," she said coldly. "We'll fix this. Samuel can't just disappear like that. We'll find a way to regain control." Clara, however, was no longer so sure. Something deep inside her had broken at that moment. She knew the secrets she had kept, the ones she thought she could manage, now threatened to destroy everything she had built. And as the evening shadows lengthened, Clara realized that her life would never be the same again. Clara stared at the phone resting in her hand. She was sitting in the room that should have been hers and Samuel's, if everything had gone according to plan. But instead of happiness, she felt an overwhelming emptiness. The ring that she had worn proudly until that day now rested on the table in front of her, a silent symbol of what she had lost. She hadn't called Samuel since he left with David, nor had he called her. Paula had tried, in her usual way, to reassure her and convince her that everything would be fixed. But Clara knew nothing would ever be the same. Paula entered the room without knocking, as she usually did, with a cup of tea in her hands. "Drink this," she said, placing it on the table. "It will make you feel better." Clara looked up and saw her sister watching her, with that cold, calculating look she always had, even in the most intimate moments. "I don't want tea, Paula," she murmured, her voice devoid of energy. "I don't want anything." "Well, we can't just sit here waiting for everything to sort itself out," said Paula firmly, taking a seat in front of Clara. "Samuel needs to hear the truth, but the truth we want to tell him." Clara frowned, though she knew what Paula meant. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Paula. Not after what happened today. Samuel no longer trusts me. I saw it in his eyes." Paula let out a dry laugh. "Trust? Clara, when have you ever cared about someone trusting you? What matters is keeping control. Samuel is a good man, and that's his weakness. He's being it right now. If you play your cards right, you'll have him back before you know it." But Clara couldn't stop thinking about David. What he knew. The boy had discovered something. She wasn't sure how much, but enough that everything was on the verge of collapse. "Clara is not who she says she is," he had said. And though Clara had managed to avoid discussing the matter with Samuel, she knew she couldn't hide the truth much longer. But she also couldn't let everything fall apart. "David knows more than I thought," Clara confessed, looking at the ring she no longer wore on her finger. "He's heard conversations. He knows there's something I haven't told Samuel. What if he keeps digging? What if he discovers everything?" Paula leaned forward, her eyes sharp and filled with determination. "Then we need to stop him before that happens." Clara looked at her, puzzled. "Stop him? How? He's just a kid, Paula. What do you suggest we do?" Paula smiled in a way that had always unsettled Clara. People believe what they want to believe. And if David keeps meddling, we can make it seem like he's acting out of sheer confusion. Samuel is already divided. If we keep putting the idea in his head that David is seeing ghosts out of the pain of losing his mother, he'll start to doubt. And once he does, there's no turning back. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "You want us to manipulate him?" "What I want is for you to take back control of your life," replied Paula, her voice firm and cutting. "Everything we've built, everything you've worked for. You can't let a child destroy it." Clara knew Paula was right, at least in part. But there was a part of her, the small fraction that still wanted to be honest, struggling to keep the balance. Samuel loved her. That was true. And she, in her own twisted way, also loved him. But her love was filled with secrets, and those secrets were consuming her. Meanwhile, Samuel and David were sitting on the couch in the small house that Samuel had rented temporarily after the wedding disaster. The suitcases were still in the entrance, unpacked, as if just doing so would mean accepting what had happened. David was nervously fiddling with his shoelaces while Samuel watched him, exhausted, trying to process the day's events. "David," Samuel began, his voice softer than it had been at the wedding. "I need you to explain everything to me. Everything you think you know about Clara." David, feeling the weight of his father's gaze, nodded slowly. "I've been hearing things, Dad. When Clara thought I wasn't around, she was on the phone with a man. They talked about things I didn't understand at first, but they mentioned Mom. They said you couldn't know, that all this had to be kept secret." Samuel felt a stab in his heart. "What kind of things, son? What did they say about your mother?" David looked at him, unsure how to explain everything. "I don't know exactly, but the man was talking about the night Mom died. He said it was a mistake, that it shouldn't have happened that way." Clara didn't say much, just listened and nodded. "But once I heard her say that you could never find out." Samuel leaned forward, his head in his hands, as he tried to digest his son's words. Clara had assured him so many times that everything was fine, that her only wish was to start a family with him and David. But the doubts his son had planted were like a slow poison, invading his mind. "Dad," David continued, his voice lower, "I don't want anything bad to happen to you, but I think Clara is hiding something very important." Samuel lifted his head, looking at his son with eyes full of sadness and concern. He knew David had no reason to make up something like this, but the idea that Clara was involved in something so dark devastated him. He had trusted her, had let her into his life when he needed her most. But now, everything David said drove him further away from the perfect image he had constructed in his mind. "I don't know what to do, David," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "If what you're saying is true, I don't know how we could move forward with all this." David moved closer and took his father's hand. "We'll figure it out, Dad, but you need to know the truth. You can't marry someone who isn't telling you everything that's going on." Samuel nodded slowly, grateful for his son's unexpected wisdom. He was just a child, but in that moment, he seemed to be the only one who saw things clearly. The next day, Clara was sitting in the same chair where she had spent most of the night awake. She knew she had to do something. Paula had insisted that the best thing was to take control of the situation, to talk to Samuel, to manipulate the narrative to her advantage. But Clara was tired. Tired of the lies, the strategies, and the half-truths. Her phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from Samuel. "We need to talk. I need to know the truth too." Clara felt the pressure in her chest increase. She knew this moment would come. She knew she couldn't escape from this forever. She stood up, looked at her reflection in the mirror for a moment, and walked towards the door. Outside, the sun shone as if nothing had changed, but Clara knew she was about to face the most important conversation of her life. And inside, a small voice kept repeating the same question. "Are you ready to tell the truth?" Clara walked through the streets of the small town towards the house Samuel had rented. The usual sounds of everyday life, the murmur of cars and the chirping of birds, seemed distant, as if the world had decided to distance itself from her. Each step she took towards the meeting plunged her deeper into her own thoughts. She knew this was the moment when the truth, or at least part of it, would come to light. But the question that drilled into her mind was, how much truth was she willing to tell? Upon reaching the house, she stopped in front of the door. She hadn't decided yet what she was going to say, but she knew that any word that came out of her mouth would determine the course of the rest of her life. "You have to be smart," she reminded herself, trying to heed Paula's warnings. But inside, something rebelled. She knew she could no longer sustain the house of cards she had built on lies. Samuel deserved to know. And David did too. She knocked on the door gently, almost hoping that no one would answer, but the footsteps on the other side were quick. Samuel opened the door, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. His eyes were tired, filled with a mix of confusion and disillusionment. There was no trace on his face of the man who had looked at her with love months ago. Now, all she saw was an abyss of uncertainty. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse. "Come in." Clara entered the house, feeling the weight of Samuel's gaze on her. David was not in sight, but she could feel his presence somewhere in the house, watching, waiting. The silence between them was thick, and when Samuel finally spoke, his voice was low but clear. "I need answers," he said bluntly, "and I don't want excuses. No more lies." Clara nodded, searching for words that seemed elusive. They sat on the small sofa, facing each other. Samuel leaned on his knees, his gaze fixed on her, waiting. "Who is that man you've been talking to? Why does David say he heard things about the night his mother died? Why are you hiding something so important?" Samuel bombarded her with questions, but his tone was desperate, not angry. He wanted to understand. He wanted to cling to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding. Clara took a deep breath, feeling as if her whole body was trembling. She knew it was time to choose between the truth and the comfort of the lies she had constructed. "Samuel," she began, her voice lower than she expected, "what I'm about to tell you, it won't be easy to hear. And I need you to know that I never wanted us to get to this point." He did not look away from her. "Just tell me what's going on." Clara swallowed hard, and finally, the words began to flow. "The man I've been talking to is named Javier. He's someone I knew many years ago, before you and I were together. He and I shared things from the past that I didn't want to come back into my life, but they have resurfaced. Javier was involved in things I never wanted to affect this new life I've tried to build with you." Samuel watched her, trying to remain calm. "What kind of things?" Clara hesitated. She couldn't tell him everything, not yet. "Javier has been involved in illegal activities, things I tried to distance myself from a long time ago. When I met your ex-wife, Maria, she helped me get out of that life. She reached out to me when I needed it most. But things weren't easy." Samuel frowned. "How did you know Maria? You never mentioned her to me." "We met under difficult circumstances," Clara confessed, feeling the weight of the words in her chest. She knew I had made mistakes, but she still gave me a chance. The night Maria died, I wasn't near her, but I knew Javier was close. I didn't know exactly what had happened. I just knew I needed to stay away from him and anything that could link me to that night. Samuel leaned back, processing the information. So, does Javier have something to do with Maria's death? Clara looked at him, knowing this was the question that would change everything. I don't know for sure, but I do know that Javier was there that night, and since then, he has tried to contact me to make sure I don't say anything. Samuel, I never wanted to hide this from you, but I was afraid of losing you, that everything we built would crumble. The silence settled between them again. Samuel stood up and began to pace the room, running his hands through his hair, clearly disturbed. And why didn't you tell me this before? Why didn't you trust me? Clara dropped her head. Because I didn't know how. Because I thought I could keep all this hidden, and that we would live our lives without this past catching up to us. But David has found out, and now, I don't know what else to do. At that moment, David appeared, who had been listening from the hallway. His face showed a mix of triumph for having been right and sadness at seeing his father so devastated. "Dad, I told you we couldn't trust her," said David, his voice trembling with tension. Samuel turned to his son, looking at him with tired but resolute eyes. "David, this is a complicated situation. Clara has made mistakes, but we need to know the whole truth before making any decisions." Clara stood up, looking at both Samuel and David. She knew this was the point of no return. If she wasn't honest now, she would lose everything. "Javier has been blackmailing me," she confessed, feeling her voice shake. "He wants money, and if I don't give it to him, he threatens to reveal things that could destroy me and everyone around me. That's why I couldn't tell you everything, Samuel. Not just out of fear, but because I thought I could protect you and David from this chaos." David stared at her, his small eyes filled with a wisdom beyond his years. "What about what happened to Mom?" Clara swallowed hard. "I don't know, David. I swear I don't know. I wasn't involved in her death, but I know there's something that hasn't come to light. Javier is somehow involved, but I need time to figure it out." Samuel looked at her, trying to discern if there was still something to salvage from all this. "So, what do we do now, Clara?" Clara lowered her gaze, knowing she didn't have all the answers, but also understanding that she couldn't keep running away. "We have to confront it, Samuel. We need to uncover the truth, no matter what it means for us. If Javier is behind all this, we need to stop him before he can do more damage." Samuel stared at her for a long time, without saying anything. The weight of the decisions they had to make hung in the air, suffocating. He knew his life would never be the same after this, but he also knew he couldn't keep living in the shadow of lies. Finally, he nodded. "We'll face it, but this time, no more secrets, Clara. I need you to tell me everything. Absolutely everything." Clara nodded, knowing she had crossed a line. Now there was only moving forward, without looking back, towards an uncertain future. Clara could not sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, Samuel's face came back to her mind, and the weight of his words echoed over and over. This time, no more secrets, Clara. There was no turning back. She had finally exposed a part of her life that she had deeply buried, but there were still many layers to unearth. Dawn found her awake, her body exhausted and her mind spinning about what would come next. She knew facing Javier would be dangerous, but Samuel was right. She could no longer keep running. As she dressed, she heard the subtle noise of footsteps in the kitchen. It was Samuel, who had also spent the night awake. His eyes, usually full of warmth, now only reflected fatigue and doubt. As she entered the room, he looked up, a brief glimpse of better times passed between them. "Have you decided?" asked Samuel, his voice grave as he poured Clara a cup of coffee. There was no trace of his usual sweetness in his tone. Clara nodded, taking a sip of the coffee that burned her throat, but said nothing. She knew that day, the course of their lives would change. I'm going to contact Javier. This has to end. I can't continue to be his puppet. Samuel nodded, though his eyes still held reservations. If you do that, it has to be with one clear condition. No more secrets between us. If he has something to do with Maria's death, we're going to find out, no matter the cost. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. She hadn't been completely honest the night before. There were details, things she hadn't mentioned, because fear held her captive. But she could no longer keep them to herself. Samuel, there's something else I need to tell you. Samuel looked at her, waiting. Javier, he's not just an old acquaintance. Before I met Maria, Javier and I were more than friends. We were involved in things that now shame me. He introduced me to a world that was hard to escape. I tried. Maria was the one who helped me break away from all that. She gave me a second chance, but Javier never fully let me go. He always kept me under his control, always with something to threaten me with. Samuel looked down, his jaw tense. So, when Maria helped you, did she know about Javier? Did she know who you really were? Clara nodded, her eyes filled with guilt. Yes, she knew, but she gave me a chance to change. She was the only one who believed in me, Samuel. I swear, ever since I met her, I've tried to be a better person. I never wanted this to reach you, but Javier, he's always had that shadow over me. Samuel remained silent for a long time, as if processing the enormity of what he had just heard. Finally, he let out a deep sigh and stood up from the table. We're going to face him, he said, with determination. But Clara, if I find out there's more you haven't told me, I don't know if I can continue with you. Clara felt the words hit her like a verdict. She knew the threat of losing him was hanging by a thread. If Javier continued manipulating them, she would lose Samuel and any chance of redemption. Hours later, Clara and Samuel waited in a discreet cafe on the outskirts of town. Clara had sent a message to Javier asking him to meet there, telling him she was ready to settle things once and for all. Each minute that passed, the atmosphere between her and Samuel grew more tense. They had decided not to tell David, wanting to protect him from the chaos that was about to unfold. Suddenly, the cafe doors opened and Javier walked in. Clara recognized him immediately, though the years had added a more sinister air to him. His dark, deep eyes scanned the room as if assessing every exit, every person. He approached them with a cold, calculated smile. Clara, he said, nodding slightly, good to see you again. And I see you've brought company. Samuel stared at him unblinkingly. We want answers, he said firmly, and we're not leaving here until we get them. Javier smiled, but his eyes showed no hint of humor. Answers? Of course. Everyone wants those, don't they? But answers aren't always pretty, Samuel. Sometimes, knowing the truth can be worse than living in ignorance. Clara felt Javier's words wrap around her like a trap. She knew he had always been skilled at manipulating situations, making people doubt what was real and what wasn't. But this time she couldn't let that happen. Javier, enough with the games, Clara said, her voice trembling slightly but with renewed determination. We know you were involved in Maria's death. We want the truth, and I want you to stop threatening me. I owe you nothing. Javier looked at her, his dark eyes gleaming with malice. Involved in Maria's death? No, Clara, you know I wasn't directly responsible for her death. I was just the catalyst for an inevitable accident. You and I know who set things in motion. Samuel frowned, confused. What are you talking about? Javier sighed, as if he were telling a boring story he had told many times before. Maria was getting too close to the truth, Samuel. Too close to certain details that I couldn't afford to let out. She tried to save Clara from me, yes, but in the process, She uncovered something that was dangerous for everyone. And when someone like Maria becomes a problem, well, you know how things end. Clara looked at him, horrified. You're saying you killed her so she wouldn't talk? I told you it was an accident, Javier replied, unflinching. I just needed her to stop investigating. But things got out of control, as they always do. Samuel, who had been silent, suddenly stood up, his face full of rage. You killed her. Because of you, my son has no mother. Javier looked at him with disdain. Your problem, Samuel, is that you see things too black and white. Things aren't that simple. If Maria had left things alone, none of this would have happened. Before Samuel could launch himself at him, Clara stopped him. Samuel, no, she said firmly. Not like this. Javier slowly stood up, his smile as sharp as a razor. If you want justice, Samuel, you'll have to seek it elsewhere. But I warn you, pursuing the truth has a price. And I'm not sure you're prepared to pay it. Clara looked at him, feeling fear and hatred intertwine within her. She knew facing Javier wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't allow him to keep controlling their lives. This isn't over, Javier, she said, with more certainty than she felt. We'll see each other soon. Javier slightly nodded his head before turning and walking away from the cafe. Samuel and Clara remained there, watching as the man who had destroyed their lives walked away once again. When silence reigned again, Samuel slumped into a chair, exhausted. I don't know how we're going to get out of this, he whispered. Clara looked at him, knowing that although Javier's words were a warning, they were more determined than ever to uncover the truth. We will, Samuel, she replied. We'll do it together. She knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt she was no longer alone. Clara and Samuel returned home in complete silence. The echo of Javier's words still resonated in their minds, like a poison slowly spreading. As they drove through the empty streets of the town, Clara felt something inside her beginning to crumble. She knew facing Javier would not be easy, but the implications of what he had revealed were far deeper than she had imagined. Maria's death, something she had long considered a tragic accident, was now tainted with intrigue, manipulation, and dark secrets. Upon arriving home, Samuel stopped at the entrance, without turning off the car's engine. His hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel, and the silence between them felt heavier than ever. Clara glanced at him, feeling the distance between them widening with each passing second. Samuel, we need to talk, Clara finally said, breaking the silence that surrounded them like an invisible wall. Samuel nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the windshield. Yes, I know, he replied in a whisper barely audible. They got out of the car and walked toward the house, each lost in their thoughts. When they entered, the familiar sound of the door closing behind them seemed to bring them back to reality, but the sense of normality that always accompanied that place was no longer there. David was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in his hands, but his look turned expectant when he saw his parents enter. He knew something had changed, that the situation had reached a point of no return. How did it go? He asked, his voice barely containing his curiosity and concern. Samuel paused before answering. It was complicated, he finally said, not wanting to give more details. He knew David had already carried too much, and that what had happened with Javier was something that shouldn't fall on the shoulders of a child. David looked at him, not entirely convinced. There was a shadow of unease on his face, and Clara knew her son wouldn't be easily fooled. Dad, did you find out anything about Mom? Clara felt a knot in her stomach. It was the question she feared the most, the one she knew David would eventually ask. And although she wanted to protect him, she also knew she could no longer keep hiding the truth. David, come here, she said softly, gesturing for him to come closer. The boy put the book down on the table and sat next to Clara. His gaze was fixed on her, waiting with an intensity that didn't match his age. "David, what we're going to tell you isn't easy to hear," Clara began, struggling to find the right words. "Javier told us some things we didn't know. Things about your mom's death." David's eyes widened, filled with a mix of fear and hope. "What things?" he asked, his voice trembling. Samuel sighed deeply and sat down in front of them, resting his elbows on his knees as he clasped his hands together. "It seems that your mother was investigating something. Something she shouldn't have found out," he explained, trying to stay calm. "And because of that, things got complicated. Javier admitted he was involved in her death, but he didn't tell us everything. He's hiding something." David's face paled, and a terrifying silence took over the room. "So he killed her?" he asked in a whisper, his eyes fixed on his father. "Not directly," Samuel said, pressing his lips together. "It was more complicated than that." Clara, feeling the urgency to reconnect with David, took his hands. "What's important, David, is that we're going to find out the truth. We're going to get to the bottom of all this, for your mom and for us. But we need you to understand that this could be dangerous." David looked at her, his eyes filled with a maturity that didn't match his age. "I don't care. I want to know what happened to Mom. If that man did something, we have to stop him." Clara felt a mix of pride and pain hearing her son. She knew David was determined to find the truth, but she also feared what they might discover in the process. "We will," Samuel said with determination. "We will do it together, but you have to trust us. Things aren't as simple as they seem, and we have to be smart." David nodded, though his expression was still laden with uncertainty. "I trust you, but we can't let Javier get away with this." Silence fell over them again, as each pondered the implications of what was to come. Clara knew the next step was dangerous. Javier was not someone who would be easily defeated, and now that they knew more than he wanted, he was likely to take steps to protect his secrets. That night, Clara barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Javier's face, his words echoing in her mind like a distant echo. "The truth has a price." She knew the price they were already paying was high, but she wasn't sure if they were prepared for what would come next. At some point in the early hours, Clara decided to get up. She couldn't lie down any longer, letting fear consume her. She put on a robe and walked to the living room. The silence in the house was thick, broken only by the faint murmur of the wind outside. When she reached the couch, she found Samuel sitting there, staring out the window. "Can't sleep?" she asked, sitting beside him. Samuel shook his head, his gaze still fixed outside. "All this feels like a nightmare. I don't know at what point everything turned so dark." Clara nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt in her chest. "I'm sorry, Samuel. I'm sorry for bringing this into your life. If I had been more honest from the start, maybe none of this would be happening." Samuel turned to her, taking her hand. "It's not just your fault, Clara. I also let myself be deceived by the idea that everything was fine, that we could leave the past behind. But what matters now is that we're facing this together." Clara looked at him, feeling a glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. "Together," she repeated softly, as if that word had the power to keep them united through the storm. The morning found them still sitting there, talking softly about what would come next. They knew Javier wouldn't stay still. They knew the truth was still far from being fully revealed. But for the first time, both felt that, despite everything, they were ready to face it. And though the path ahead was filled with uncertainty and danger, Clara felt that, somehow, they had taken the first step toward freedom. A freedom that would come, yes, but at a price. The first lights of dawn filtered through the curtains of the living room as Clara and Samuel, still seated on the sofa, decided it was time to take action. They had talked for hours about Javier, about Maria's death, and about the dark secrets that had been buried for so long. But talking was no longer enough. They knew they had to confront what was coming head-on, with no more excuses or delays. Samuel slowly rose, feeling the weight of sleeplessness on his shoulders, and looked at Clara with an expression of fatigue that echoed all he had endured in recent days. "We need to find out what else Javier knows," he said with a firm, yet exhausted voice. "And most importantly, what he's hiding from us." Clara nodded, knowing this wouldn't be easy. Javier is clever. He won't just sit still while we try to unearth what he's hiding. You know him. He has his ways of manipulating. "That's why we need to move fast," Samuel responded, in a tone Clara had never heard before. It was a mix of determination and desperation. She knew her husband had reached a breaking point. Javier had taken Maria from him, and now he was close to destroying what little was left of their family. They couldn't let that happen. Clara, however, had an idea she hadn't shared with Samuel. It was a piece she hadn't wanted to move until she was completely sure, but there was no more time for doubts. "I know someone who can help us," she said cautiously. Samuel looked at her in surprise. "Someone else? Someone from your past?" Clara nodded, though doubt was etched on her face. "An old contact, someone who worked with Javier in the past but distanced himself when things started to get more dangerous. If anyone knows what Javier is hiding, it's him." Samuel furrowed his brow but nodded slowly. "All right. If this person can help us, we need to talk to him as soon as possible." Clara took her phone and dialed the number she hadn't used in years. As she waited for an answer, her heart pounded fiercely. This was a risky move, but she knew there was no other option. After a few rings, a deep, cautious voice answered on the other end. "Clara?" "Yes, it's me," she replied, trying to control her nervousness. "I need your help. It's about Javier." There was a long silence, and Clara held her breath. Finally, the voice spoke again. "Give me an hour. Meet me at the old warehouse, where it all started." Clara hung up, her heart beating even faster. "He's going to help us," she said, looking at Samuel, though she couldn't help feeling a sense of unease. An hour later, Clara and Samuel arrived at the old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was deserted, its gray walls worn by time. Clara remembered every corner of that place. It was here that she had first met Javier, and where her life began to tangle in everything she had tried to escape. Now, she was coming back to confront the ghosts of her past. A car pulled up at the entrance of the warehouse. Out stepped a tall, slender man with graying hair and a serious expression on his face. Marcelo, Clara's contact, was someone who had always kept a low profile, moving in the shadows. But he had been one of the few to distance himself from Javier before everything spiraled out of control. "Clara," Marcelo said as he approached, his eyes scanning the area before settling on Samuel. "I suppose all this has become more complicated than you expected." "Much more," Clara replied, trying to stay calm. "We need to know what Javier is hiding. We know he was involved in Maria's death, but there's something else. Something he hasn't told us." Marcelo nodded slowly. "Javier has always been a man of secrets, but there's one in particular that has kept him safe all these years." He paused, looking at both of them seriously. The night Maria died, it wasn't just an accident. She had discovered something about Javier's operations that endangered him, something much bigger than his relationship with Clara. She was about to uncover a network of corruption involving powerful people who couldn't afford to be exposed. Samuel narrowed his eyes, incredulous. "Corruption? What kind?" Marcelo sighed. "Javier has always been a middleman. For years, he's facilitated operations for powerful people. Money laundering, influence trafficking. Maria found evidence of these operations. She was determined to expose him, and Javier knew it. That's why he went to see her that night. He wanted to make sure she wouldn't talk." Clara felt the ground crumbling beneath her feet. She knew Javier was dangerous, but this was far bigger than she had ever imagined. What happened then? Maria was determined not to stay silent, Marcelo continued. She was a strong woman, not one to be intimidated. But when Javier realized he couldn't stop her, things got complicated. It wasn't him who killed her, Clara. Javier isn't the direct murderer, but his connections, his allies. They made sure Maria couldn't speak. Samuel clasped his head, clearly struggling to process everything he was hearing. Then who killed Maria? Who are these allies? Marcelo looked at him gravely. Powerful people. People who are far above Javier. If you try to confront them, you'll need more than just evidence. You need allies, someone who's willing to protect you when all this comes to light. Clara and Samuel exchanged a look filled with fear and desperation. They were in the heart of something much darker and more dangerous than they had imagined. What can we do? Clara asked, feeling hope fading away. Marcelo looked at her seriously. The only way to stop Javier and those backing him is to expose them. But that means you'll be in danger. If you want to go forward, you must be prepared for the consequences. Samuel clenched his fists, his face hardened by rage and determination. I don't care about the danger. If these people killed Maria, we'll do whatever it takes to bring them to justice. Clara looked at him, feeling a mix of pride and fear. She knew this was the only way, but the risk was immense. We'll do it, she finally said, her voice firm. We can't turn back now. Marcelo nodded. Then, get ready. Javier will fight to protect his secrets, but if you're determined to confront him, I'll help you. We're going to need solid evidence. Clara took Samuel's hand, and for the first time in a long time, she felt they were moving towards the truth, even though the cost of uncovering it might be more than they could bear. The battle had just begun, and they knew there was no turning back. The sky darkened as the clock marked the last hours of the day. Clara, Samuel, and Marcelo were gathered in the small living room of the house, their faces tense and the atmosphere charged with expectation. Everything they had discovered in recent weeks had led them to this moment. Javier, the secrets he was hiding, and the evidence they had. All were ready to be exposed. Marcelo had done his part. After securing evidence of the illegal transactions and the web of corruption Javier managed, they had gathered enough material to hand over to the authorities. But they knew they couldn't just go to the police. The people behind Javier were powerful, and they couldn't trust anyone. They would have to be careful, strategic. Samuel, leaning on the table, looked at the documents with a serious expression. What if it's not enough? What if these proofs don't bring them down? Clara, who was sitting next to him, placed a hand on his arm. It will be, Samuel. It has to be. We can't let all this be in vain. Marcelo, who had been silent for several minutes, looked up. The evidence is compelling, but the risk is in how the pieces move after everything comes to light. Javier is not the real power behind this. If he falls, someone else will try to take his place. That's why we need to expose everything publicly, Samuel said, his resolve renewed. Not just Javier, but everyone behind him. The media must know about this. If it gets big enough, they won't be able to cover it up. Clara nodded, knowing this was the only path left. They had been running for too long, hiding from the shadows that pursued them. But now they had the truth on their side. We'll publish everything, not just with the police, but with the press. If we can get the story out, they won't be able to hide. Samuel took Clara's hand and looked into her eyes. He had come a long way since the wedding day when the trust between them had shattered into 1,000 pieces. But now they were together, fighting for a truth that both needed. We'll do this together. The next morning arrived with palpable unease. Clara and Samuel decided to go to the local TV station. They knew that once the information was broadcast, there would be no turning back. Marcelo stayed at the house, making sure all the documentation was ready to be handed over to journalists and the authorities at the same time. When they arrived at the station, the producer greeted them with a mix of surprise and curiosity. It was not every day that people came in with such an explosive story. Clara spoke with as much calm as she could muster while explaining the details, while Samuel showed the evidence they had gathered, from illicit transactions to connections with local power figures. The producer watched, unable to hide his astonishment. This is huge," he murmured, flipping through the documents one by one. "We need to prepare the broadcast. Are you sure you want to do this? Because once it goes out, there's no stopping the storm that will follow." Samuel and Clara looked at each other, knowing this was what they had been waiting for, and nodded in unison. "We're ready," Samuel said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. The broadcast aired that night. As Clara and Samuel watched the images on TV, the weight of what they were doing finally sank in. It wasn't just Javier or the corrupt figures who had protected their dealings. They were facing a system that had allowed all this to happen for years. The report detailed the corruption, the dangerous connections, and most importantly for them, Javier's involvement in Maria's death. "She died trying to expose the truth," Samuel said in the interview, his eyes red but filled with determination. "And now, at last, we can finish what she started." The response was immediate. The phone didn't stop ringing. Journalists from across the country wanted to talk to them, to learn more details, to get more information. But threats also arrived. That very night, Clara received a message that chilled her blood. "You don't know what you've gotten into. This isn't over. We can still reach you." Clara showed it to Samuel, and both knew they could no longer underestimate the danger. The decision to expose everything had not only endangered Javier, but them as well. They knew the next few hours would be critical. In the early hours of the morning, a car stopped in front of their house. Clara and Samuel looked at each other, knowing it could be Javier or someone worse. But to their surprise, when the car doors opened, they saw FBI agents stepping out. The case had reached further than they expected. "Sir, ma'am," the agent approached them. "We've seen the report. We need you to come with us. You're not safe here." Clara and Samuel looked at each other, realizing there was no choice. Marcelo helped them gather essentials while the agents made sure no one was following them. The danger was now too great. Before leaving, Clara turned to look at the house one last time. She knew their lives would never be the same. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Samuel hugged her. "We will. We'll get justice for Maria. And for us." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Investigations expanded, involving several high-level officials who had been shielded for years by Javier and his contacts. Justice began to move, slow but sure. The wheels of power started to turn against them. Meanwhile, Clara and Samuel, under protection, kept watch on every new development. Finally, the news came. Javier had been arrested. The charges were multiple, not only for illicit activities, but also for his involvement in Maria's death. Clara and Samuel listened in silence, knowing that, though it had been a long and painful road, the truth had finally come to light. Months later, Samuel and Clara visited Maria's grave. The wind blew softly, and the silence of the cemetery surrounded them as they knelt before the gravestone. "We did what you started," Samuel said, his voice trembling but firm. "Your fight was not in vain." Clara placed a flower on the gravestone and looked towards the horizon, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. Despite all the pain, they had done the right thing. As they stood up, hand in hand, they knew the future was still uncertain, but also that they were ready to face it together. The sun began to rise, and with it, a new hope for them. What do you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. What would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a sign of support. This motivates us to keep uploading exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next amazing narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We greatly appreciate having you here with us. You can click on the links that are appearing on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment especially for you. See you in the next video. A big hug.